What if instead of hearing this ad, you were hearing an entire extra episode of Cinema of Meaning? Well, each month, Tom and I record an extra bonus episode that's available exclusively on our creator-owned streaming service, Nebula. So far, we've talked about Sam Mendes' 1917, Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, and Stanley Kubrick's masterpiece, 2001: A Space Odyssey. And coming up, we have an episode about Nicholas Winding Refn's Drive. To get access to those, just sign up for the Curiosity Stream bundle and you'll get free access to Nebula along with that. The link is in the description below, or you can go to curiositystream.com/cinema of meaning. Get access to the bonus episodes of Cinema of Meaning and our normal episodes ad-free and a week early when you listen on Nebula.
Welcome to Cinema of Meaning, the podcast that seeks to explore the depths of what cinema has to offer. My name is Tom, you may know me as the creator of Like Stories of Old, and I'm joined by fellow video essayist Thomas Flight to talk about Richard Schenkman's The Man from Earth. Thomas, you had never seen this movie before, right?
That's right, yes.
What was your initial impression of it?
This is an interesting little film. It's kind of a bottle episode, theatrical, one location style movie about this professor who's leaving for unknown reasons. And so there's this like impromptu goodbye party for him. There's a bunch of other faculty from the school, presumably there, other professors, and they're kind of like understandably wondering why he's leaving. And it's not a spoiler because it's the premise of the movie. He starts to tell this story that he is actually this 14,000-year-old person, that he thinks he's like Cro-Magnon man or something. And this conversation and interrogation of that concept and idea follows. And it's a very interesting film. For people who haven't seen it, we'll probably talk for a little while without spoilers. There's not very many major spoilers here, so we can push them off.
Yeah, there's some twists towards the end, but it's not anything that's going to ruin the experience significantly, I think.
Yeah, it's low budget. There's a few places where there's some like corny music or lines or acting maybe by today's standards, or you can feel the like constraints of the budget, but it held my attention the entire time for being one location. It does a pretty good job of just like pulling on different threads and following interesting lines of conversation and thought. And yeah, I found it to be, thought-provoking and interesting and worth watching. I'm looking forward especially to kind of where this might lead in terms of discussion. So was this your second time watching it?
Yeah, I think I first watched it about 10 years ago, maybe. Not long after it released, I think. It's a movie from 2007. And I remember back then when I was first getting into film, so to say, this was a movie that would pop up like on a lot of these lists with like hidden gems or deep movies that you've never heard about and great movies set in one location. Like this was a movie, it felt like a kind of underdog movie, like a cult movie maybe, and I think it definitely has like quite a significant cult following. I still see like every now and then it pops up on Reddit or somewhere, or it's recommended on some list with underappreciated movies, and yeah, I think it definitely deserves discussion. I think it is still, even now watching it again, it's still, as you said, it's not a well-made movie. Like there's no real distinctive like directorial voice or like a distinctive aesthetic. It's not particularly well made, or at least it's not poorly made, but there's nothing about it that really jumps out immediately in terms of like visuals or the other aspects of presentation. It just feels like a kind of low budget TV movie, which I think it was at the time. But yeah, as you said, it's definitely one that grabs your attention pretty quickly and then manages to hold it pretty much all the way to the end. There's some moments where I feel like the pacing wanders off a little bit, but it's never for like too long before it kind of pulls you back in again. Like there's a lot more way bigger budget movies recently that I've been a lot more bored with than this one.
Yeah, that's true.
So I think it's definitely an interesting case study. I think everyone who's into movies should at least watch this one just to see the sheer power of a fascinating story and just how easily you can grab someone's attention, even if the budget is bare bones and the actors are not the greatest. They're okay, but the script also doesn't allow for much character work, really. Although
Yeah.
I do think the main character, the guy who claims to be the 14,000-year-old man, he does sell it convincingly, in my opinion. I think he presents his whole character with a sense of grace and quietness and subtlety that really helps to sell the story as a whole. The other ones, in that sense, I think they are less important in terms of like making or breaking the movie, but they're adequate. But yeah,
Yeah.
I think it's a fascinating story in the sense that, as you said, it's just dialogue, basically. It's just a conversation. And what probably fascinates me most about it is that the movie this is like all concept. It's not really a story almost. It's really just like there's this scientific or science fiction concept. Like, what if someone who was a caveman lived until today, basically?
Yeah.
That's, I think, that the question that's at the center of this story. And initially it's presented as such. Like the main guy, John Oldman, he
Yeah.
calls himself with some humor. He initially presents his story as, he doesn't just come out and say, hey guys, actually I'm 14,000 years old. He kind of presents it as like exploring this book that I'm reading about this man who's potentially lived since the caveman age. And he asks his fellow colleagues, like who are all experts on various subjects like anthropology or biology or psychology. I'm not sure what exactly all of them did, but basically they are some people who have some knowledge about, who have their own insights in that subject. And together they start exploring what that would be like. And then, of course, it kind of intensifies as they come to understand that he's not really exploring a story, but that he's actually quite serious about it. You don't see it a lot, and it seems to go against all the rules of storytelling, that you just have the concept and then kind of leave out character arcs, kind of leave
Yeah.
out like a real 3-act structure even. But I actually really like it. I'm not sure what your thoughts are on that. Like,
I definitely like films that lean more heavily on the idea of just like having characters tell a story. There's a short film by David Lowery that's like 14 minutes long, and it's just like a bedtime story. I think it's called The Pioneer. I'm pretty sure it's on YouTube or Vimeo. You can watch it. And it's just like a dad, presumably a father, telling a bedtime story to his son. And that's it. That's the whole short film. That kind of thing is often like more enticing than we think it's going to be. Like there's something about storytelling, like an actual person just sitting there telling a story, that can be quite engaging if they're good at it. And this film definitely leans on that. And like I said, I found it to be engaging. And I don't think, like, if your brain is occupied and you're like invested in the concept, like if you get invested in the concept and it feels like the concept is being explored thoroughly, like you don't necessarily need character development and character arc. I think maybe there could be a little bit more of it here in terms of like the other characters. So we don't get much development from John, but that kind of makes sense. I mean, he's been around for like 14,000 years. His psyche is probably pretty developed and like set in its ways.
Yeah, I think it would probably work against the movie if he would suddenly have a significant character arc in this.
Yeah.
What to him would be this infinitely small moment in his lifetime.
Yeah. There's kind of like, they kind of patch in something else for instead of a character arc, which we'll get to later, but there's kind of twists that like reveal more about who he is. And so there's like a development in terms of your understanding of like him as a character, but it's not a genuine, like he doesn't change within the course of the movie, just your understanding of his character changes. But I do think like there's definitely shifts for the other characters in terms of like how they're grappling with the situation or realizing it. And I think some of those either could have been more fully developed or maybe just sold a little better. You know, I don't know what the answer would have been, but there was times where like suddenly it seemed like some characters moved from like being skeptical to like almost being very invested and kind of believing him. And I didn't feel like I necessarily felt all of the steps along the way to get from, you know, one point A to to point B. That varies. It's not like that for every character. But overall, I was invested enough in the concept that I didn't find that to be like overly detrimental or distracting.
Yeah.
One of the interesting ideas at play here that they latch onto pretty quickly is like it's all concept, but there's several ideas being explored. There's like just the theoretical idea of if somebody lived for 14,000 years, what would that be like?
Yeah. How does that happen?
Yeah, how does that happen? I think those details, if you've watched any other media that kind of deals with this kind of idea, a lot of those concepts are here. And this movie might have been earlier than them, but if you've seen like The Eternals, the idea of like, oh, you have to move on periodically, or like a lot of those ideas are here and developed. But then there's also like other questions that come into play. And one that was very interesting to me is just sort of I don't know if you would, ontological maybe is the wrong way to put it, but the sub question of would this even be verifiable? Like if somebody was telling you this story without like, oh, let's ship him off to a lab and like test him for 1,000 years, would you even from talking to somebody be able to like test or verify this kind of claim? And I think that's a very interesting like route of examination.
I think that's a question of epistemology.
Epistemology,
the question of knowledge, what can we know, and then followed by methodology with how do we go about doing so. And yeah, that's definitely one of the interesting questions that the movie brings up. Is I particularly like the one of the characters asks him at some point, like, if you've been around for so long, don't you have any artifacts from way back? To which he answers like, that's no, of course not. Like, do you still have your like some scissors that you owned 10 years ago or something like that? They really go in detail with these questions that kind of fill in plot holes basically, or try to make sense of the story, but it's in the same time those questions are also integrated into, they are part of the story. So it's not just like, oh, it's trying to patch the holes in its own concept, but it's really that's and again, that's what I love about it. It really takes this concept and then makes the story about exploring such a concept.
Yeah.
It reminded me a little bit of like Ex Machina, for example, the way that movie also presents us with pretty much one simple quest, like, okay, I've got this robot, now let's see if we can determine if it's conscious or not. And that's also what from the same guy who did that, Alex Garland, he later made Devs, the TV show, but that's one where I was kind of disappointed because it felt like we had that interesting concept, but it was also like filled up with all this other stuff that to me didn't necessarily contribute as much to the story. Like, I think that was a 8-part miniseries, but yeah, I think that to me that show, there's parts of it that I love, but to me that could have been a fascinating like 2-hour movie without all the fat turned away. Like for me, I think more movies should embrace the idea that humans just like to have their brains titillated sometimes, right. And they don't always need the typical ingredients of a movie, as long as you can just engage them intellectually in some fascinating exercise that also enlightens a lot about humanity and about the way we see ourselves. And that's I guess brings us back to what you asked about, the way they are basically interrogating him and the way that reveals our own limitations about how we can verify things, how we can connect to history in a way, because that's also like a big question. Like, that's the question of him, his individual life, but also of like the initial people that he came from, the kind of the civilizations that he was a part of, and how we connect to those civilizations through whatever means we have now. Like, there's, for example, another thing they bring up is his consciousness basically in his early years before what we would say as language. And then he says like, oh no, we had language, we just didn't write it down. And we also wondered about the stars and our place in the universe. It's not like we weren't these ape-like beings that only later transformed into the actual humans. No, they were still humans all the way back then. And that to me was actually one of the most revelatory parts, I think, about, because I still think we tend to look at our like caveman ancestors as these kind of brutish, languageless beings, whereas I think now there's not so much evidence, but there's more theories about them being more articulate, more sentient in a way that we are too, even though they didn't necessarily have the benefits of accumulated knowledge over the ages and through writing and that sort of stuff.
Yeah. Modernity definitely like conceptualizes intelligence in a way that has such a strong emphasis on like basically knowledge that is can be written down or accumulated and memorized, that like practical knowledge, philosophical knowledge, like participatory knowledge, like all these different forms of intelligence that would have been taken a much stronger role in the past when you were, interacting with nature, hunting, early agriculture, like all of these things. We tend to have a separation from that as like, oh, those people could be just as intelligent as us, just as smart, but, it looks different than how we tend to classify those things now. I think that's still true today, where you have people who aren't considered as intelligent by certain standards because we tend to like reduce knowledge into this kind of specific category. So it's definitely, yeah, it's fascinating to think about that. I also like how they contextualize like, he has this subjective individual perspective of history.
Mm-hmm.
And so like they talk about, what was it like in this moment? Or, you didn't know that you were whether you were seeing the ocean or not. Like, how couldn't you have known that? And it's like, well, if you didn't have a map, if you didn't have the knowledge that we have now, and you just saw waves and a horizon, water that stretched out to the horizon, you have no way of knowing what that is or what you're seeing at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's such an interesting point to illustrate too, because we tend to do that, or at least I do when I think about history. It's almost impossible to get out of that mindset of like the perspective we have now of history, looking back on it, like understanding that all of the people who were living through those various times in history were experiencing it subjectively, like in that moment, without the perspective on the events that we have now. And I think there's a certain amount of misunderstanding that often comes with that, where we think those people are dumber because who would have believed that the earth was flat, because it's so obvious. And it's like, yeah, but
just sail to the edge.
Right. If you've only ever stood on a continent and you have no Google Maps, you have no, nobody sailed around the world yet, like none of that knowledge is in place. It's like your immediate experience of the world presents a certain thing subjectively, and you would have no reason to like go beyond that necessarily until you learn otherwise.
Yeah. I think there's another misconception there too about, aside from the scientific knowledge that's progressed over the years, is that we often tend to look back at ancient religions or even the cavemen who had their own versions of different myths, and that even though today we would see those as not necessarily as literal, but we see them as like allegorical or symbolical, and we believe that back then they took it more literally, whereas I think they've also found, and I'm pretty sure that Johns also mentions that in a movie somewhere, that it wasn't that different back then as it is now. Like they had some awareness that they were making stories and metaphors, and that they were not necessarily giving shape to the world in a literal, objective sense. But that's also kind of, I think, a modern projection from us on the past. And I also like the way John's lifespan is basically the entirety of civilization, that his early years can be kind of defined as childhood. And if you look at the way we look at our childhood, it's not just our own memories and actual experiences that we recollect, because I'm not sure about you, but like my childhood, like especially my early years, it's just like glimpses, like flashes like images and fractured moments. And that I've only now, like I contextualize them with my adult awareness and my now like grown up context to those certain experiences. But
right,
I to some extent, in doing that, I've also lost the memory, I think, of what it was like back then before having had that additional context.
Yeah.
Like, to give you a small dramatic example, but I remember when 9/11 happened in the United States, I think I was 10 years old then. We had a small event at the elementary school that I went to where we had to stand in a circle and we had to basically do like a moment of silence and think about the tragedy that just happened. And I remember what it was like. Like I remember standing there, but I don't remember the exact how that affected my awareness. Like was I
Right.
aware of like what exactly had happened, what the weight was of what had happened, or was I just like, is that just now me filling in the gaps, knowing as an adult what happened
Yeah.
and the impact it had on the years that followed it? But just a small example. But that's,
Yeah.
I think, what this movie also tries to illustrate about the way we both look back at our own lives is, and the way it relates to how we look back at history in general.
Yeah. I've I've definitely had experiences of like a lot of my earliest memories are also things that we have, like I have photographs of events, and it's like my
Mm,
first birthday party, I think it was my first, maybe it was like second or third, but there's an early birthday party that I have like a vague memory of, and there's photos of it. My memory of it is from my own perspective, not the perspective of the photo. But it's like, to what
mhm,
extent has the photo, is that memory still there because the photo's there to reinforce it? Or to what extent, like, is the photo taken over the memory for me? And like, I can still like patch it in and imagine it from, the perspective of me sitting in like a high chair or something, but it's really
mhm,
not a memory. It's just, me projecting that into onto like what I can see from the photo. And similarly, John has kind of those types of things that he points back to, where he's like, he has this knowledge that he's since learned from like textbooks or history books or whatever. And he's like, his memory of those things are so foggy, but he also can't now separate his memory of it from, what he's learned about it, and what he's read in the textbooks. And that presents a problem with trying to even like quiz him or verify his knowledge of the past, because it's like they could ask him all these questions, and it's like, but anything he says that is true or that aligns with our current contemporary understanding of the past, he could have read. And anything he, says that, doesn't, there's no way of like verifying that historically,
mhm,
at least that I could think of. I can't, nobody in this movie thinks of any like questions or methodology for verifying or
mhm.
trying to verify. And there's none that I know of, but they may be out there. I think that's one of the fun things about this is like, as you're watching it, you start engaging with the ideas and you're like, what would I ask him? Or like, how would I try
Mm,
to
yeah.
figure out if this is real or not, which is a fun game.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. And also just imagining what it would be like to live that long and
Yes.
kind of think about what you would have done throughout history.
Yeah.
To make another note on what you said about the old photographs, I'm not sure if you do that too, but I have, for me, at least, I think a sign of when I've done that, when I've kind of replaced memories with the artifacts that I have from those memories, is that I have certain memories that are not necessarily in first person. Like you can imagine if you have a literal memory, that's something
Yeah.
you explicitly saw and then saved to your long-term memory. But some of my memories, they're more like, they're not exactly like third person, but they definitely aren't first person either. It's kind of hazy about what, more like an omnipresent camera type
Yeah.
memory, which kind of tells you about that. That means the whole image is basically fabricated to some extent, which is weird to think about. But yeah.
Yeah. That's something they don't necessarily get super into. I mean, it's there
Mhm,
as a subtext within the story that he's telling, but the mechanics of how memory would work over this amount of time would be fascinating to think about, because you would definitely have these bits and pieces, but we don't really know what the human mind's capacity to remember is beyond like, the normal human lifespan.
mhm,
And there's definitely very much a possibility that if somehow somebody was living, for this amount of time, it's like everything past like 200 years ago would just kind of fall into this like void. And like,
mhm,
well, they kind of touch on that a little bit in that like, he's like, he doesn't really, he's like, I think I'm a Cro-Magnon man. He doesn't really remember all the exact details of like where he
mhm,
came from, and part of that is because the way he was subjectively experiencing those events. At one point, he talks to one of the characters. She's like, "How do you not know where you're from?" And he asked her about like where she grew up and whether it would look the same now if you went back and like all these things. And he's like, if there was no maps, if not only there wasn't a name for the place at the time, but over the course of over 10,000 years, everything changed, how would you even begin to verify that? So he is just kind of this like person existing in time without like a feeling of, any sort of beginning.
He's very disconnected from his own origins in that sense.
Yeah. Which I do wonder, this is just occurring to me now, but I wonder, certainly there's people who feel that way in the world now, and probably were a lot more in the past, people who felt that way. Because I think in the modern world, we all are very connected. Not all of us, but most of us have the privilege of being like very connected to where we came from. Even if you have lost touch with your parents or you were separated from them or you don't have contact with them at some point, like most people have access to some type of birth record or like photos from their childhood or something like that. But if you didn't have those things and those memories start to fade, it's very possible, you can exist and be like, I don't know how old I am. I don't know where I'm from. I don't remember my childhood really. I'm just a person who, in my memory, kind of started emerging into existence in this like space, roughly in the 90s or something. I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting that the movie doesn't really get into how it affects his sense of self, but
Yeah.
I guess after 14,000 years, you'll find a new identity. And
Right.
it's funny how he kind of has these little moments where he does these throwaway lines almost about like, oh yeah, I owned a couple of castles at some point. Or he kind of vaguely mentions having had these really fascinating life events and then kind of casually moving on from them too. But yeah, it's hard to say. That's something that the movie doesn't really go into, like what is really the essence of his character and what are the kind of trendy aspects or the ones that kind of changed along with history.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like would he have been pro-slavery, for example,
Right.
or stuff like that? Like where this, I'm guessing not, as he also mentions pretty early on having studied with the Buddha and having gained some respect for human life, some sense of morality. I guess maybe also a longer lifetime maybe might give you a stronger sense of morality over time as you become more detached from the specifics of a culture or any particular ideology, because you start to get that overview effect. But I think that it might have been deliberate that the movie sort of avoids those such discussions a little bit.
Yeah. There's a little bit of convenience in some of the plotting or the staging of the life he's kind of lived.
And the way he does, like coming back to the problem of history that we talked about and how difficult it is to reach back in time in that way. And because of the subjective experience and the kind of the stuff that does survive is more like objective documents or government stuff, and less so the subjective experiences of like regular people, which as a side note is also why I really like the documentaries of Ken Burns, for example, because he does try to bring about that more ground up sense of history by like including letters and diaries and that sort of stuff. But anyway, so the movie does on the one hand try to complicate the question of history by bringing up his subjectivity, but at the same time he also happens to have had encounters with all of these very prominent historical figures. Like that's a bit of like, I'll take it as like to add like the sense of movie drama, but it's pretty convenient that of all this, the kind of the line of history that we have, that he's somehow been pretty close to it and been pretty close to all the most important events that we now, looking back, are familiar with.
Yeah, we can get more into that too, and there's some spoilers involved there. Before we move on into that, I think going back to kind of the psychological impact or like him as a character and the way he's been shaped by this kind of life, that it was one area where I kind of wish they had gotten a little bit more into it. There's some other media that kind of explores this topic that I like that has gone there a little bit more. There's the Jim Jarmusch movie. I think I've even mentioned it on this podcast before when we were talking about the Eternals. Only Lovers Left Alive, which is about vampires who have also been alive for thousands or 10,000 years or something. And he kind of really, in that movie, like really explores sort of like the mental and psychological impact it's had on them, and sort of just the like headspace that they're in. And it's different. I mean, I think the effect it seems to have on John, we see a little bit through like just the performance and what seems to be his personality. And he's like a little bit jaded, but mostly has like, it seems has this kind of like stoic view. Like, I've seen it all. You know, there's nothing new under the sun, really. And he has this very measured, you know.
Very calm, yeah.
And there's a difference. The way he's had to live would have had an effect on that, too, because he never ages and people notice that he's been a nomad for like his entire life, moving on every like decade or so. And so he hasn't been able to just like stay in one place, which also has an effect on, you know, people's view of the world and how they experience things. So
yeah, because if you think about it, if he moves every 10 years or so, that's over the course of like 14,000 years. That's a lot of time. That's like 1,400 times that you've completely uprooted your life and settled in somewhere else. And yeah, I wonder what the accumulated weight of that would be, but the movie seems to not really get into. He still seems motivated to try and engage to every time like he moves to become part of a new local community. Although he does mention that he's had periods where he was like more reclusive, or then he would just kind of hide away for a couple of decades and then come back. So it might be like he does suggest there's a sort of ebb and flow to his lifestyle, and I guess that makes some sense. I think it's easy to imagine that someone would get completely jaded and completely cut himself off from life, but you can imagine like if you're living potentially for eternally, like that's gonna get boring too.
Yeah.
So at some point I feel like there's gonna be this yo-yo effect where you kind of get tired of it all and then get tired of being tired of it all and then
try different things out.
And then go on like that.
I want to give a shout out to, if people are interested in media that explores that idea specifically, there's I don't know what to call it, an online piece of writing, I guess. It's kind of like a long short story. It's a short story, but it's a multimedia story that you read in the browser. It's by John Boyes, I think is how you say his name, or Boise, Bois. And it's called 17,776. And it's about a society where people have suddenly started to live forever. It's specifically about football in that society, which sounds really weird, but it's about how they've come up with this extremely convoluted version of football that's evolved over tens of thousands or like almost tens of thousands of years at this point, and how they just like entertain themselves as like eternity stretches on with this like really bizarre version of football that looks nothing like modern football. And it's for anyone who's interested in like films that explore like humans living forever or deep time kind of stuff. It's definitely worth a read. I
hadn't heard of that one, so it looks interesting.
Yeah, it's good. I highly recommend it. It's very entertaining too, like because there's, like I said, it's multimedia, so there's a lot of images and graphics and like stuff to go along with it.
Yeah, I'm looking at the Wikipedia page right now, and it incorporates text, animated GIFs, still images, and videos hosted on YouTube.
It opens with two satellites who are trying to communicate with each other. And so the first few, like the first chapter takes place on this calendar that you scroll through, and the satellites can only like send and receive messages every like 217 days. And so you have to scroll down the calendar from like one message to the next, like for the back and forth. And it just gives you this like sense of like passing time. It's kind of a masterpiece, I think. But yeah, maybe if we ever do a non-film episode, Cinema, that's for our other podcast, Websites of Meaning.
Yeah.
Anyway, back to the topic at hand.
The Man from Earth. Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, we've talked about kind of him as a character and how this would impact his life. We've talked a little bit about like the process of trying to verify whether it's real and how, like, at least in this movie, they kind of bump up against this idea of like, you can't really verify it, at least not in this setting of just having a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting, like, as you go along through the movie, you know, you don't really know. I mean, the movie's a little spoilery, I think, in the sense that the way it's framed, I felt like kind of made me think that he was telling the truth.
Yeah, I think you definitely go in at least wanting it to, or kind of assuming it is true. There's just by virtue of the movie's premise being exactly this. So there is a bit of a disconnect, I think, with the other characters who are more skeptical, and you're just like, especially there's this really intense Christian lady that kind of debunks everything from the beginning, and you're just like, that's ridiculous. Of course you'd believe him, like,
Right.
even though it makes no sense for you to do so, but there's definitely a bias as the audience that you have towards his story being true that kind of affects the way you experience the other characters in the movie. But I think this is also where we can move into spoiler territory a bit, because that's also what reveals the most about how his presence or existence basically affects and impacts the characters around him. The first twist, at least, is that the question kind of moves towards religion and if he was part of like any biblical events, and he doesn't want to talk about it at first, and then he's like, okay, I may have been part of some of it, and they're starting to guess, and then he kind of carefully states like, okay, what if some guy who studied East with the Buddha went back to the Mediterranean or the Middle East or that area and tried to bring some of those teachings to a small group of apostles, and then got prosecuted for it and thought he would. There's a bit where he suddenly says like he got crucified, but not with like the spikes in his hands. He was just
He was
binded
just
to the
tied.
cross. But so, anyways, he basically claims he was Jesus, and
Right.
then but then he makes up these abilities. It seems like, oh, I can like reduce my vital signs to the point where it seems like he is dead, and then of course he wakes up in the cave, and some people spot him walking out, and then that's the rest is history. That's the big reveal, the big claim he makes, that he was Jesus Christ. And that, to me, that I think I remember when I first saw it, I thought it was a bit farcical, like, of course, American movie, you have to go there. But I do like the way it really tried to. It's really the ultimate example of how a small, tiny event in history can have significant consequences through myth making, and especially like the way that transforms over time, even though the event itself may have been relatively ordinary. But yeah, of course, there's the Christian lady who takes great offense at his claim to being Jesus Christ.
Yeah. Yeah, the Christian is a little bit, I think to some extent, a lot of the characters are sort of caricatures. Like there's the psychologist who kind of like ends up pulling a gun on him.
That was another moment, like, of course, American movie, someone pulls a gun out of nowhere.
There was a few moments where I kind of wished the characters that they had available were like a little bit more of like a steel man version of some of the views, instead of like a straw man version where it was like the arguments that some of the characters were leveling. I was like, there's probably better ways to deal with it than just being like offended and being like, it's blaspheme. It's like, are there people who would do that? Absolutely. But is that the most interesting like route to explore this, like essentially a thought experiment of this idea? Probably not.
And also, especially because she was supposedly a teacher of. She wasn't just like the average Christian lady from the church. She was also someone who had some scholarly knowledge about religion, which wouldn't mean that she wouldn't be like religious herself, but at least I think she would have been
more used to like interacting with people who are making claims that
exactly
are offensive to her sensibilities. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But I think like one of the things the movie wants you to kind of, by the time it gets to this point where this revelation happens, it feels like most of the people are pretty bought into his claim. They're starting to sort of believe it. And so by the time he's like, well, I am Jesus, or like I was the person responsible for the story of Jesus, at least, they're like, then that suddenly takes on this much more significant, because they're out of the mode of just like, oh, this is a fun, like, kind of thought experiment we're all having, and more into like,
Mhm.
let's debate this as an actual possible explanation for, Christianity, which I think like
Mhm.
I do think derailed the movie a little bit, because that section is interesting. It's like, it is interesting in its exploration of, like you said, like myth formation and like all of these things. But I think it kind of takes a turn away from like the core concept, which is
Mhm.
his life and living 14,000 years, and like what that would be like, and the ideas surrounding that, and temporarily like sidelines itself into like more of a discussion about like religious epistemology, which is like, it's also interesting. But I wish, instead of taking a turn, they had just gone deeper into the concept
Yeah,
itself.
it does feel a little bit like this is the whole movie is like this atheist perspective who couldn't resist like taking that little
Right.
jab towards Christianity at the end. And but I do like I don't think it's worked in quite as well as some of the other aspects, but I did like the way, if you really take the point of view from the other characters, there's this sense that from their perspective, they have known this teacher for like 10 years, and suddenly what started out as this normal thought experiment is like turns into this way too extreme. Like he's suddenly like, they are also upset because they're just losing their sense of his identity. Like what
Right.
the man they know is suddenly turning into this weird person that takes this joke way too far, or not. Either way, he's kind of like attacking our worldview in increasingly serious ways. And so, from that perspective, I've on second viewing, especially, I was more sympathetic towards the drama that kind of emerges from the other characters, even though as you said, it's kind of it's not worked in as like this straight line that suddenly grows in intensity towards the end, but it kind of flip flops from being offended and then being interested in the idea again to being flabbergasted at the way they've lost their old friend, and then
Right.
offended again. And then their emotions are kind of all over the place, but there is some sort of through line that I can imagine being there that kind of makes sense within that gives the story like a little bit more, besides the basic concept, and a bit more of emotional weight. But it wasn't quite there yet, especially the final twist at the end. He's not just Jesus Christ, he's also towards the very end, in what feels like a twist to something that was never really set up, he turns out to be the father, I think, of
Yeah.
one of the professors, the old psychiatrist. He suddenly has this whole childhood trauma live up, and when he yeah, it's not, at least I don't remember it being set up earlier that he talked about his childhood, but then or the father that he lost, and then at the end John kind of reveals it accidentally that he used to be a professor named so and so, and that was the name of his father, who the psychiatrist's father. But yeah, that to
Yeah.
me is where the movie kind of crossed
Jumps
the
the
lines
shark.
into, yeah, kind of went
Yeah.
into farcical territory, because it didn't really add anything
Yeah.
to the story itself. It was literally like after the movie had pretty much ended. But yeah.
There's a moment towards the end where he kind of he then pretends, because I think the movie ends up making it pretty clear that, like, at least within the world of the movie, he's telling the truth. Like, it doesn't leave it with, once you have that twist of like, oh, he's the father of this older guy, it doesn't leave a lot of ambiguity. But there's a moment before that where he's like, oh, it was all just like a crazy prank, basically, that I just like took too far. Sorry guys, like, wasn't this a fun thought experiment? And they all kind of like believe that or disbelieve that to various degrees, or are like kind of relieved, but then like have their doubts. But there was a moment where I thought maybe the movie would leave it with more ambiguity and just like kind of cut it
Hmm.
off at that point. And I thought that would have been a very interesting like way to frame the movie, where you have this character that's like very committed to this, and you let that play out, but then you just end the movie, and essentially you're in the position of like the characters at the party of just saying like, well, was he telling the truth? I don't know. We'll never know. Here we go. But it decided not to take that route.
Yeah, that's now that you say that, it's definitely true that it does add that definitiveness to his story in the way maybe they were trying to show that even subjective history can be interpreted as objectively real if your subjectivity happened to cross over with that of the other person or something.
Right.
This scene takes place outside, and some of the other characters are already gone or still inside the house
Yeah.
at that point, and I'm not sure exactly. So it's only revealed to that guy who wasn't necessarily like the biggest disbeliever. So I'm not sure what the point was of revealing that specifically to him. But yeah, I think the movie would have been better off if it ended with him kind of retracting his revelation about it all being real and just saying like, oh, sorry guys, it was a joke, I took it too far.
Yeah.
And now you're left wondering.
There's a woman who's kind of seems to be I guess is in love with him. There's a little bit of a underdeveloped romance, but she seems to believe pretty early on. They deal with it in different ways. I think Dan, I forget what he was what his professorship was in, because there was a biologist, a psychologist, like different.
I think there might have been a sort of, not a paleontology, but someone who studies like old artifacts and stuff.
Yeah.
A historian or something.
He was the character whose perspective I kind of identified with the most, or at least like the way he handled the situation, which was like, kind of like almost he was like not antagonistic, but also was like wanting to play along, and towards the end like wanting to believe. But then once he's like, oh no, it was just a joke, he's like, well, that was kind of a fun, like I feel like how he interacted with the situation would be similar to how I would have.
He was also really upset. Like, I think he was crying at some point.
Oh yeah. He does buy into it a little bit by the end. Yeah. And I forgot about that. Maybe I would. I don't know. But I wanted to say, I love how the Edith, the super Christian lady, as they're all leaving, there's this moment where she kind of like, puts her hand on his cheek and then kind of like gives him a kiss on the cheek. And it's a little bit like, she's like, you can see in her eyes, there's almost this like, just in case you are actually Jesus, I want to make sure.
Yeah. Even though he revealed that being Jesus essentially meant not that much.
I thought that was an interesting, like, how he both like deconstructed her faith, but also she was still like, and she didn't like that. She was still like, just in case.
Yeah. She deconstructed him based on her faith. Right?
Yeah.
So she kind of projected more importance on him in that sense than
he was claiming.
Deserved. Yeah, I think that was also something that bothered me a little bit about the religious stuff, that I think they tried, like, the first part of the movie really tackles the kind of the logic of it, like, or at least at first the whole practicality, like, oh, didn't you get ill, or didn't you get like wounded? And then he's like, there's the kind of convenient thing that he doesn't scar also. And then there's the more like the question of verification, like what can we know, and how do we tell if you're telling the truth, basically. And there's also that nice little bit where he has this artifact of like some caveman tool, but he says he got it at a thrift shop and he meant it at the end. And the Dan character is like, okay, that's pretty clever, because he could have lied, but he didn't. So that's might have been an interesting sign that he was telling the truth.
Right.
But then when the religious stuff comes, it's also, I think that's when they're also trying to explore some sense of morality, like they're trying to make an attempt at some sort of universal moral truth about what his life signifies, or what kind of like the wisdom that he has gained over the years, that there must have been something regarding ethics as well.
Yeah.
And that to me fell a little flat, because that was the obvious, I think especially in 2007, that was very much this kind of new agey interpretation of the New Testament, especially, where the Old Testament was kind of discarded as like these silly, savage creation stories, whereas the story of Jesus was kind of modernized into this kind of Buddhist slash Stoic slash basic kindness type philosophy. And that's also what his morals eventually come down to. It's a pretty simple message. And of course, he laments that people can't live up to it. But yeah, that to me felt a little bit simplified compared to some of the more thorough scholarly explorations that come beforehand.
Yeah. I think the discussion around like then the verifiability of his like religious claims and like his
Mm-hmm.
kind of argument with the Christian lady does kind of overshadow then like this broader conceptual exploration of like, would living that long give you moral insight in a way that might be unique or distinct
Mm-hmm.
from just like everyday humans? And it's kind of asserting that like it does because, you know, he accidentally ended up being like one of the most influential, or maybe the probably the most influential religious teacher of all time. But it doesn't like yeah, I don't know. I think I agree that it doesn't quite sell that or explore that as authentically as some of the others.
I think it would probably have been more interesting if they just straight up asked him like, did your like long lifetime on Earth
Right.
give you any specific moral insights without him necessarily being the literal Jesus Christ?
Yeah.
Because yeah, it does at that point it does overshadow the other parts of the story, and I think the direction that the story could have gone if it had refrained from going biblical in that sense.
Yeah. There's an interesting layer there with the religious stuff though too, where he's like essentially making these claims and then they're getting upset about them, but like ultimately like his claims still come down to a sort of, you have like this firsthand witness, but then there's still like an element of like, because they've already determined that his story is kind of like unverifiable, there's still this element of like, well, you know, if you're gonna believe his story about being Jesus, it's essentially like you would essentially have to just have faith that he's telling the truth, which is kind of a funny parallel.
Yeah, that's definitely ironic that even if he claims to be Jesus and claims to have that not mean as much as people think,
Right,
it will still require them to take that leap of faith in.
right. To believe that. I
Yeah.
mean, it fits more comfortably within a materialistic, you know, scientific worldview to have somebody saying like, you know, oh, but I
Hmm.
mean, without verifying the somebody can live for 10,000 years, that's also a sort of like extreme metaphysical, almost metaphysical claim until you could like scientifically verify it. Or it seems kind of supernatural, even though it's not like treated that way in this film.
I think even then, like, I think if they had sent him to a lab where he was researched, like, I think even then people would take issue with the quote unquote facts and
Right. Yeah.
be skeptical. And especially, like, there may have been like some message there about, or like somewhat intended about, oh, if Jesus Christ came back today, he would just be crucified again because people would
Right.
see his sudden appearance or like his second appearance as blasphemous.
And then you would also have the people who are like, you know, I know you're claiming not to be God, but you've lived for 14,000 years and somehow, you know, that's so I'm going to I'm going to act like you are God because you're
Hmm.
seemingly the most like powerful human that, you know, there would be all kinds of conspiracies about why he's living so long and probably some people who would believe that he is. There's a comment about that, like about him as Jesus coming back, which is a kind of funny one.
Yeah, I wonder what his story would be like if it came out now in the current age of misinformation
Yes.
and the internet and weird theories and amateur explorers on the internet and investigators.
I almost never think this because there's too many remakes these days, but this is a movie that definitely could be remade in an interesting way. I think, like, you know, if you
Hmm.
updated the budget a little bit and got like a fresh cast of experienced actors in there, and then like you could have some overlap, but there's so much room to explore this concept that like I think you could do it again and still hit on like fresh and interesting, even just by like tweaking the character of John a little bit, like have him experience different like things throughout his life, or have, because it's all theoretical, you could imagine that he's been impacted in a slightly different way by his life, or just have him be a woman or something.
There is a brief suggestion that there may have been others like him.
Yes.
He mentions at some point that he met someone who he suspected, or they both suspected of each other that they were who they were, but they weren't quite able or quite ready to explicitly say it to each other. And then he says like, oh, I think I saw him again 100 years later or so on a station somewhere. But so it is, there is a seed for franchising.
Yeah. I want the Man from Earth cinematic universe.
Because that's what filmmaking is today. Any final notes on The Man from Earth? I think we've covered most of the interesting aspects of the movie so far.
Yeah, I don't think so. I find this to be a fascinating concept, a fascinating thought experiment, and this movie does an interesting job of like following that thread and exploring some corners of it. Even if it's not perfect, it kept me entertained, and like it explored it in an interesting enough way that I was pretty interested. So I think one of the cool things about a movie like this is like, in some sense, it's almost inevitably going to leave you unsatisfied, because like most of what it does is just provoke a bunch of other questions about the nature of life, and like, but that's why it's fun to talk about, and why we can easily spend an hour talking about this, because, you know, it raises a lot of.
I think that's actually what I like about it, that the way it raises questions without necessarily giving us, it does try to, as we talked about with the ethics stuff, it does try to give us some answers, but I like the way it raises questions in a way that makes us reflect on those questions, and at least think about the impact they have on who we are and how we look at the past and at ourselves, and without necessarily reaching this needlessly sentimental or overzealous conclusion about this is life and this is how you should feel, or something like that, you know? So yeah, I agree. It's a fascinating thought experiment. It's a movie that will definitely grab your attention and hold it towards the end, even though it's pretty low budget and it might not look that way when you first put it on. But yeah, I think it's definitely a movie that you should check out at some point.
Yeah. It's worth exploring, even just from the perspective of like seeing what can be done with lower budgets and a more constrained style of storytelling. Yeah. The Man from Earth.
Thank you all for listening. If you enjoy the show, be sure to check us out on our creator-owned streaming service Nebula, where you can experience our podcast ad-free, listen to all of our episodes a week early, and get access to monthly bonus episodes that aren't available anywhere else. On Nebula, we for example covered the latest Doctor Strange movie, Sam Mendes' 1917, and we discussed Stanley Kubrick's science fiction classic 2001: A Space Odyssey. Right now, the best way to get access to Nebula is by signing up for CuriosityStream, which comes with a free Nebula subscription. To learn more, visit curiositystream.com/cinemaofmeaning, or just follow the link in the show notes. And we'll see you again next time.